Hi, I'm Mia Hubbard, MAZON's Vice President of Programs, and I want to welcome you back to the JCJM main stage and to welcome you to today's panel discussion, From Erasure to Resilience, the Future of Food Security and Food Sovereignty in Indian Country. Thank you all for joining this important conversation. Um, for 35 years, MAZON has been committed to ensuring that vulnerable people have the resources they need to put food on the table. And as you know, we're a leading voice on anti-hunger issues and are particularly known for our focus on issues and food insecure populations that this country has failed to give their just due. And for centuries, our federal government has failed horrifically at the fulfillment of its duties and obligations to Native nations. For thousands of years before contact, Indigenous peoples sustained politically and culturally vibrant societies that were as diverse as they were dynamic. The legacy of colonization and conquest has left deep wounds and harms on Indigenous communities, and food is very much a part of that story. The genocide of Indigenous peoples did not occur simply because of the inability to resist disease or American military aggression, but also because settler populations deliberately destroyed their food systems, leading to starvation, ecological disruption, and devastation. Food was used over and over again to control, to coerce, and to reinforce the goals of colonialism and structural racism. Stolen land, the forced relocation onto reservations far away from traditional sources of food, the near extinction of the buffalo, and the denial of hunting and fishing rights are just a few examples of the strategies used. And over time, Indigenous nations' ability to feed their people based on their traditions and customs were erased and replaced with food deserts and US government rations and federal food commodity programs. And for a long time, these programs were focused on mere subsistence and survival of Native peoples and sought to assimilate and erase connections to Native food traditions by supplementing Native diets with unhealthy Western food staples. So we can draw a direct line from colonial actions to federal food policies to current day conditions of food insecurity, high rates of obesity and diabetes and other diet related diseases, and the destruction of tribal food economies. But the story doesn't end there. And today we're going to be talking about the powerful and inspiring efforts to reclaim and achieve food security and food sovereignty that are taking place across Indian country. And I'm so excited to have three of MAZON's longtime Indian country partners joining me here this morning. Crystal Echohawk is the founder and executive director of IllumiNative, the first and only national Native-led organization focused on changing the narrative about, about Native people on a mass scale. Crystal, who is a citizen of the Pawnee Nation, built IllumiNative to activate a cohesive set of research-informed strategies that illuminate the voices, stories, contributions, and assets of contemporary Native peoples to disrupt the invisibility and toxic stereotypes Native people face. Colby Duren is the newly appointed Director of Policy and Government Relations at the Intertribal Ag Council. In his role, he directs the Native Farm Bill Coalition, which represents the largest ever coordinated effort in Indian country around federal food, agriculture, and national and nutrition policy. Colby is the former director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas, and which is another key partner of MAZON's Indian country work. And Colby has over 13 years of experience in federal Indian law and policy with a focus on food, agriculture, nutrition, natural resources, and economic development. And Maria Givens, who is a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe and the Communications and Public Relations Director of the Native American Ag Culture Fund. NAF is the largest philanthropic organization devoted solely to serving the Native American farming and ranching community. Prior to joining NAF, Maria worked on agriculture policy at the National Congress of American Indians and led NCAI's efforts on the 2018 Farm Bill. And let me just say parenthetically that Jamie Sims Hip, who is the CEO of NAF, had intended to join us, but she was recently appointed to the Biden transition team. So she's busy helping to stand up the next administration, and sends her regrets. And we're so grateful that Maria could step in on such short notice. So I want to get started with you, Crystal. And in my early in my opening framing, I talked about how settler colonialism sought to erase Native people from the land and to erase their connections to traditional food sources and food ways. And I think it's important to realize that invisibility and erasure, these are ongoing forces. These aren't historical facts from just the past. So I wanted to talk to you and kind of ground our conversation in the concept of Native invisibility, because I know your work at IllumiNative was really born out of public opinion research that looked at what Americans know and think about Native Americans. And this is some really groundbreaking research that you did a couple years back. So can you give us a sense of what do we mean when we say Native invisibility and erasure, and what does your research tell us about its pervasiveness?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Mia. It's so good to see you, and it's just so wonderful to be in this circle today with everyone. And I'm coming to you today from the traditional lands of the Muskogee Creek Nation, of which their treaty rights were recently affirmed this summer by the Supreme Court, but also known as downtown Tulsa. So, just, to take one step back, as you mentioned, like this research that we really did to begin to kind of understand, how does the lack of visibility, affect Native Americans in today's society? And what really brought me into this work actually was my initial, work and advocacy in food systems work, and really looking at the issues of diabetes and obesity prevention, and really understanding the importance of food and food systems. And really, as I, got deeper in that work, at the time I was working for the Nota Begay Foundation, and then eventually left to start my own business, of which, Jamie Hip was one of my mentors, within food systems. And I began to really understand, as I was engaged in that advocacy work with people in philanthropy, with policymakers, people who are real influencers and decision makers within this space, I began to understand that they knew nothing about Native peoples, and really to understand that history that you gave, that covered that, really looking at the absolute destruction of our food systems and how we got here today in terms of the, health disparities and other issues that we face. We just didn't get here without things happening, but was really fundamentally understanding that the American public and people in decision-making positions didn't understand or know anything about us, and that we were very much invisible in these larger conversations. And so that's what was the catalyst for me to launch the Reclaiming Native Truth Project, which was the largest public opinion research project ever conducted to really about Native Americans, in terms of examining what are the dominant perceptions that Americans from diverse backgrounds hold about Native Americans. What are the dominant narratives out there, and where do they come from? Why do people think the things that they do, and how does that affect us in terms of the way that Native peoples not only are perceived, but treated by the courts, by Congress, by the media, in schools, and just throughout society? And what we found, which was, I think we knew instinctually going in, but we actually found that one of our greatest threats was our invisibility to the greater American public and people, in operating in the spheres of power in this country. And that, we found, for example, that nearly 80% of Americans know little to nothing about us. We also, found that nearly 90% of schools in this country don't teach about Native Americans past 1900. And so literally, when you think about just that data point, you think about the power of the K through 12 education system. They're literally pumping out generation of Americans that the last data point they probably heard about Native Americans was probably around the 1890s, Wounded Knee, and that's it. And they don't grow up, they don't go throughout their academic career understanding that we are very much still here today, that, tribes are sovereign nations with a unique political status in this country, and have government to government relations with the federal government. And so most Americans don't know that, and they're not even sure that we necessarily exist anymore. which was just really incredible. And then also we examined popular culture, TV, film, in different types of media, and found that our representation, hovers somewhere between 0 and 0.04%. And that small sliver of representation that makes it through is oftentimes really damaging and harmful stereotypes, right? About, drunken Indians, kind of impoverished, pitiful Indians, crime. There was a study done that found that the majority of Native women, for example, that are depicted in films don't make it to the end of the story without being killed off. And so you look at that sliver of representation, and it was just really understanding as well that, we found 72% of Americans don't even encounter information about us, right? So there's not, even if you're sort of inquisitive and think to ask, it's really hard to find information. And what we found is that in itself creates its own bias. And we worked with Dr. Stephanie Freiberg out of the University of Michigan and her team. And they really, after examining all of the data and the research that we did nationwide, that invisibility begins to be the modern form of racism in this country. It creates almost an implicit bias of which we are just not included in key decisions that get made. And when we examined, Congress, we actually interviewed a number of members of Congress, and they agreed. The issues of invisibility in Congress when it comes to looking at forming legislation and policy that impacts the American public today, they're not thinking about Native Americans. We also found that, because of our unique status in this country and due to tribal sovereignty, the federal courts play a large role in our lives, and that the majority of federal judges in this country have not even taken any classes regarding federal Indian law, or could really even give a good definition of what tribal sovereignty is, yet they're making really important decisions regarding treaties and, treaty rights and other kinds of things. So it has real impact. It's not just a question of representation and political correctness. It's really connecting with that social science that invisibility does really fuel bias and, unfortunately, racism.
Yeah, and I think for anyone who does work in Indian country, we understand that, and that we're constantly battling that invisibility. And I think, like you said, I think that the fact that what fills that void are stereotypes, ignorance, bias, allow for attacks against tribes, limit the ability of tribes to protect their sovereignty, limit the ability of Native leaders and their allies to shape and inform policy, and allow for kind of that policy neglect and policy indifference that we see often. And it has real implications. So one of the things that I appreciated about the work was that you also came up with some advice for advocates and allies who for around messaging. And can you talk a little bit about that? Like some of the things that we should and shouldn't be doing around messaging to help battle this and confront the invisibility.
Yeah, definitely. Well, what we found is the biggest thing is, actually people want to know about Native Americans. And I think the majority of the American public don't want to, have bias, right? Or not treat Native Americans well. It's just a lack of education and, access to accurate and contemporary information. So part of this is just about basic re-education, because the school systems have really failed us as a country in terms of the poor and inaccurate education, particularly around Native Americans, that our students are not getting. So what we learned is, number one, is that you have to kind of level set, you have to sometimes do your Native American 101, as much as you'll talk to any Native advocate out there and they get exhausted by it. But there's a reason why now we understand there's big systems of education and media and popular culture that have, through that erasure, make it necessary. But we have to make it bite-sized. We can't give everyone the 500 plus years of what's happened. But it's just really educating, keep people about the key issues about the federal government's treatment of Native peoples in this country, about the broken treaties, right? About just the very succinct history you gave about just when we talk about food systems. Just that basic bit right there is the perfect thing to kind of invite someone into a conversation where they have an understanding. And then I think this goes, I think this is really important now, but it's really also about connecting around our values. And I think we're so polarized right now, but what we found through our research is that we have an ability, even when we kind of get siloed in, that when we can connect around our values about, we all care about our children, right? Or we all want our people to be healthy and safe. We want people to have access to affordable and healthy, nutritious food, right? Then, and then there's a way to start to kind of have that bridging conversation. And so we really found that just, that values conversation is important, and that we just have to really constantly remind people that Native Americans, we are still here, and we're more than still here. We're thriving. We're not sort of, we hear a lot about the negative things and the disparities in Indian country, but we don't hear enough about the resilience and the leadership and the innovation, which you're going to hear a lot about in a minute by my colleagues. And that, and so you kind of have to thread the basic history, the values, reminding people that we're still here, and that while there's really positive things happening, yes, there are challenges that need to be addressed. And then what is that call to action where we can really partner to do something together? And that we found through our research, really, by using that, it really shows that words matter and how we frame conversations. And we find that we were really able to move public opinion on big policy issues regarding, the environment and healthcare and other kinds of things, but even on tough issues like mascots, right? And as we showed, there were some big changes this summer. So I think, the takeaway is that words do matter in how we talk about things.
Absolutely. And I think for me, that reminder that we don't want to rely heavily on the deficit or disparity frame, that we want to really lift up the assets and the strengths and that desire for self-determination. And I think that's something that I've really taken to heart in the work that I've done and in the way we talk about our work in Indian country as an organization. So Colby, I want to get you involved here because you have spent years working alongside tribes and Native advocates to transform U.S. Federal food policies and programs. And as I mentioned at the outset, they come with some historical baggage. And you have been working to try and reimagine these programs as a vehicle for supporting tribal efforts to reclaim traditional foodways. So can you talk about those efforts? How have programs like the FDIPR program evolved over time, the food distribution program on Indian reservations? For those who don't know, FDIPR. Talk about the ways that tribes and their allies have worked together to transform these programs.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Mia, for having me. I'm very honored to be in such a panel with such esteemed colleagues and friends as well, too. I'm coming from the traditional homelands of the Waganux and Western Neantic peoples and what is now Connecticut. And I'm honored to be able to talk to you about some of the work that we do and kind of what really, this comes through. So when we talk about the role of federal food programs, and to hit on something that Crystal talked about, when we're talking about this, we're talking about tribal governments, and there's a strong government to government relationship that exists between the federal government and tribal governments. And all of that was really established and prepaid for the land takings and cessions that occurred. And essentially the promise of things, the promise of education, healthcare, access to other lands, access to traditional foods and traditional subsistence ways of life, but a lot of times also including access to food and agriculture. And so there's always been some type of food or agriculture assistance or components with the federal government working with tribes that existed throughout time. And to fast forward a little bit to where we are now, as Mia mentioned, the FDIPR program, why it exists and what does it do. And when the food stamp program came about in the 1963 and then the 1973 Farm Bill, they made it a permanent program. There was a realization that new benefit program doesn't work in Indian country. There's no place to redeem it in a lot of different places. So they looked at some of the existing food assistance and commodity programs at the time, and then basically cemented it in law as the FDIPR program. So when that program is really structured, it is basically to deliver food to tribes to distribute to citizens that need it. And so throughout the time of that program, the incredibly passionate folks who run and manage that program, who we have the honor of working with very closely along with our friends at MAZON, have done a lot to try to make sure that that program not only has access to healthy, nutritious foods, but traditional foods, and ensuring ways that food can be delivered that fits the needs of each individual tribe and the citizens that they're serving. So from what we're getting from the 70s to almost 2014, in establishing, I think all of our friend and mentor, Janie, was essential in establishing really a strong tribal leader and tribal consultation that happens between the Food Nutrition Service at USDA and tribal leadership. And those conversations, even though we span a period of over 40 years to getting into those, have done so much to be able to not only bring the attention of what the issues are historically, systemically in the program, what currently exists, but allows for the mechanism to have seats at the table where you have leaders of governments talking about how to go about solving those problems. And from time, we've been able to see an increase in traditional foods being included in the program, different mechanisms of being able to deliver and provide food in there, to looking at saying we have tribal governments having the authority in this program. And as Mia mentioned, talking about tribal self-governance and self-determination, how do we expand and build upon that so that tribes can fully run these programs in the way that is going to be the most impactful and provide the best service for citizens and the healthiest food. And so for some of those different ways we've been able to come out, not only with the conversations, but also be able to say, okay, these are the things that tribal leaders and tribal program managers are asking for, and getting USDA to understand what those are, to acknowledge what those are. And so when the policy component comes in, which I'll get into a little bit, and the Hill is looking to make changes, or a farm bill comes up, they'll say, oh, we are familiar with that. We understand how that works. And no, that's something that we as an agency at least can acknowledge that we would be looking to be able to implement. And it so, but I think to this way, it takes a lot of work like that to engage on that type of level, to acknowledge the government to government relations to happen, and having allies that help support that as well too. And I also just want to acknowledge that in this work with with the National Association of FDIPR and the Native Farm Bill Coalition work as well too, that having such a strong ally like MAZON there to be able to talk about the importance of that and use their strong voice to say tribal self-governance and self-determination is essential in ensuring that nutrition programs that reach Indian country are led and driven by tribes and by tribal leaders has been essential in helping make some of the strides forward in that.
Yeah, I think, as advocates, we like to intuitively think that these programs and policies can be enlisted to repair past wrongs, right? And I think when I've gone to those tribal consultations and the work that we've done together on the Hill, I think it's exciting to actually see the possibility that a government program can really be co-opted and used in this way to really interrupt the legacies of colonization and really advance and reclaim traditional foodways. I mean, literally tribes are at the table saying, we want these kinds of foods. We don't want those kinds of foods. We need these programs to work in these ways and not in these ways, because this is how it's going to best impact us. And so I think it's very inspiring to actually see that the federal government has the potential to be a key ally when tribes are at the table and pushing them. But I also know that our government also wrestles with this idea that Native communities are in the best position to govern their own affairs. And I know that you spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill and representing Indian country concerns in Congress and at the executive branch level. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the challenges that you and others who advocate on behalf of these programs and on behalf of Indian country face in terms of obstacles and barriers when we're trying to advocate for tribal food sovereignty and Native-led solutions. What are the kinds of arguments that you hear that you have to kind of counter?
A lot of it goes into what Crystal mentioned, is talking about the educational component and just really having that being the centerpiece of it. And because we're in this time with a new administration, a new Congress coming in, every time there's a new Congress, all the folks who advocate know, like, this is the time it's like, oh, like, who do we have to go talk to teach about what's going on, to give basically the Indian country 101, what are the levels, little issues, and kind of get everything kind of back to that beginning place. And I think that's probably part of it as well too. And throughout my career, a lot of it was being able to do that. And then also as a good friend and mentor of mine and a few other people out there, Diddy Stills Day, we talked about, is trying to fight for those 5 words added, or 5 letters added onto, like and tribes, trying to be able to have that added onto legislation. And then I think when you get to that point, it's then it gets to the model that we talked about with the FDIPRA consultation, where it's not just the, okay, we added tribes, now we can now move on. It's the, okay, no, before we even get to adding and tribes, before we get to anything drafted, what are we going to do to ensure that there's inclusion of voices at the table in the beginning phases of that? I think that's what we were trying to accomplish in the work with the Native Farm Bill Coalition and partnering with MAZON and the 170 tribes and 15 tribal organizations involved in that, is being able to say, how do we set the kind of stage and provide the educational information that not only talks about what the specific issues and components of it are, but what are the solutions that can be provided and done. And so it takes being able to develop those types of I think relationships and conversations, so that like you're able to get to a place where it's like, we know that tribes need to be involved in this process. We may not sure exactly how, but that's when they come in to be able to say, okay, how do we bring this in here? Or what tribes should we be talking to? Who are the tribal producers that should be involved in these conversations? So that we're really kind of getting past to the idea of really being, okay, tribes are included, but actually being at the table at the drafting process early on in the process. And that takes very strong allyship and partnership to be able to do that. And you know, I've worked on a handful of farm bills, and I think seeing the progression of how that's gone to where you would see, you know, there would be a handful of tribal provisions in some bill, thanks to the work of the Intertribal Agriculture Council and their executive former director Ross Racine and current executive director Zach Ducheneau, being able to knock on doors and do that, to growing and expanding that, to being at a place in the 2018 Farm Bill where the Native Farm Bill Coalition was able to get 63 tribal specific provisions. That is just what is like probably one of the longest test cases of just continually educating, building partnerships, building allyships, and bringing to the table. And so now what we're looking to do is to basically take those and the strong partners we have, like with me and y'all at MAZON and all the tribal organizations involved, in saying, okay, great, now that we've basically done that level of education, where can we go now? And how can we be able to take it so that we're looking at full tribal self-governance and tribal self-determination and programs at USDA, because now that's not a concept anymore, that's a reality. So now how do we build upon that reality and that acknowledgement from Congress?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, I know one of the things that struck us over the years is, you know, hearing elected officials and even colleagues in our field who question the capacity, right? Do tribes have the capacity to assume management and administration of these programs? And I think, you know, sometimes that's code for something else. And it's, you know, a subtle racism at play in some ways. And I think I feel like over the years we have been more and more effective as a movement to really counter that concept of whether or not tribes have the capacity. And in fact, I think it's the opposite. It's that it's untapped, it's undertapped capacity, and to really give examples of you know, tribes are definitely best positioned to be the ones to know what their people need and to assume responsibility and oversight for these programs. They just need to be given the chance. And I think one other thing I would mention, Colby, and maybe you can help me with this, is just it gets back to something Crystal said, but the invisibility of tribes in data as another barrier. You know, I think we often don't see Native people in data sets around our issues, around hunger, around food insecurity. You're just not there. And you know, sometimes it's not the data is not disaggregated enough, or it's just simply doesn't exist. And to the extent that it does, it's as if all Indigenous people from all of these different regions and all these tribes are the same. And so we don't really have the kind of fine-grained data that would be really helpful, I think, in some of our advocacy work. And so I think that's another place. And you know, I think even just, you know, this is an ongoing issue, is a perennial issue. I think even just, was it CNN, you know, on election night? I think Crystal, you might have actually been the one who had spoken about this publicly. The election night demographic data on voters and Native Americans being labeled as something else. I think she's muted.
Yeah, no, apparently we're something else, but
Yes.
we're really awesome. But I think, yeah, it was so hurtful, to see, and it was actually a downgrade. I went back and looked at the 2016 graphic that CNN used, and we were other. In 2016, we were downgraded to something else. So
right. So I mean, Native Americans, not even named, right? And so I think,
yeah, we had a big impact on the election. So
exactly. So I mean, I think that's another issue, another barrier that comes into play with our advocacy work from time to time as well. So Maria, I want to bring you in on this conversation. We have been using this term tribal food sovereignty or native food sovereignty a couple times today. And I would love for you to help kind of unpack that for us. What do we mean when we say tribal or native food sovereignty, and why is it important?
Yeah, definitely. So defining food sovereignty is a really big issue in Indian country because there isn't a major conclusive definition. So, the Via Campesina has their definition about the right of peoples to healthily and culturally appropriate food produced through sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So that is a good place to start. But when you think about Indian country, we're sovereign nations. And that takes a different shape when you have policymaking as part of your governmental authority, with the federal trust responsibility between tribal governments and the federal government. And also tribes are large landowners too. And so we are producers, we're consumers, we are the people in the middle of the food system as well. And there are all of these different government programs that have these impacts. So forgive me for the pun, but it is something else in Indian country.
Right.
Because it's a very big idea. And also, to Crystal's point earlier, our food systems have changed and evolved over time, just as we as people have too. And so we have a lot of people focusing on traditional foods that have been the culture forever. And but then also, like my tribe in Coeur d'Alene, we have a 3,000 acre wheat farm. That wheat is not traditional to us Coeur d'Alenes, but it's been in our community, part of our food system and our relationship with agriculture for about 100 years. So it is becoming a culturally relevant food for us because it has that long history in our community. And, another point is that food sovereignty means something different for every tribe in the country. Mm-hmm. What works for Crystal's tribe is not going to work for my tribe and vice versa. So food sovereignty, maybe folks are really focusing on high production and getting a lot of food out of the land that they have. Maybe it's really just focusing on traditional foods. Maybe it's focusing just on one traditional food because that is a really culturally important food for them. I think of, I'm up here in the Northwest, and people focus on salmon for a reason, because it is the keystone species and everything comes down from that. So if you focus all your efforts on salmon, then the rest of the food system is going to benefit from that. And so it looks different all across the country, but I think really just focusing on tribes and communities' self-determination to decide for themselves what it means. Mm-hmm. And then also thinking about it on the individual and the community level as well, because when we think about our traditional roles, there were some people that their role was to dig roots, and there were some other people and they were a hunting family. And so assuming those roles, and that's an act of food sovereignty as well. Mm-hmm. And so what's really beautiful about all food system work in Indian country is the diversity of it, and that there's so much that we can learn from each other, that folks who are not in Indian country can learn from us, and we can learn from them, and we can just kind of move forward together.
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that. I think it's very easy to forget that there is this diversity. There's 573 sovereign, federally recognized tribal nations, and state recognized and unrecognized tribes. So there's a lot of diversity. And yet what I'm hearing you say is that there are some guiding principles that kind of unify. And one for sure is that food and food systems are important beyond just the provision of sustenance, right, of nutrition and calories, that they are intertwined with land and with language, with ceremony and with tradition, and that there's this larger concept of community wellness and health. And so that's why, we talk about indicators like self-determination and cultural continuity and tribal control, because those are important factors in achieving food sovereignty. So I think you're right. It's a much bigger concept than just food.
It definitely is. And it ties, what I love about food is that it ties everything in. It is the culture, it is the history, but it's also the environment. It's also economic development. For my tribe, our 3,000 acre wheat farm was the only way we made money for most of the 20th century. And so that supported scholarships, so that it's education, it's everything all mixed into one. And you have to eat every day.
Indeed. So NAF is deeply involved in channeling financial resources to support Native farmers and ranchers and Native ag in general. So can you talk a little bit about the need for financial investment, particularly philanthropic investment in Indian country? And maybe, just talk a little bit more about some of the things that you all are supporting.
Definitely. So NAF, the Native American Agriculture Fund, where I work, is a relatively new organization. We were started in 2018 after the Keep Siegel v. Vilsack litigation, where it was a big class action settlement against USDA for discrimination in primarily access to credit programs. So tribal producers were seeking credit through USDA programs and were denied. And that's the 1-minute version of Keep Siegel. Colby could probably talk about it for another hour or two.
Yeah.
And so we were set up as a private charitable trust and to take the remainder of the class action funds and distribute them throughout Indian country. And so we are a spend down trust. We have 20 years to make this big investment in Indian country. And we don't take that responsibility lightly. And so we have put out funds in 2019 and in 2020, and we're just about to release our 2020 youth grants. And I'm really excited about that because, when we invest in our youth, we really invest in the future. And that is where we can make the biggest impact, where we get the highest return on our investment, is when we are investing in these youth and getting them connected to their culture and their land, and through all of these food system programs. So I'm really excited about our youth programs. We did some last year as well. And I'll just share one of my favorite projects in California. The California Indian Museum, they have a youth council, and their youth council got together and said, hey, we really love our traditional foods of acorns, and we want to start making some money off of this and create a value-added product. So they started creating these acorn bites through their program through the museum, and they are making them themselves and selling them online. You can go online right now and buy some. But these are youth that are taking the initiative themselves. They see the value of that cultural traditional food, and they're turning it into an economic opportunity to fund their youth programs. And so we're helping them just kind of continue and sustain their program. But it's just really inspiring to see folks, younger folks especially, take this initiative and really kind of decide what future they want to see. And, you know, I'm really excited about these investments and how we can move forward together, because there has not been historical investment in native ag before. My mom, she runs a wheat farm in Idaho, and for her, the financial resources just aren't there for her to do take her operation to the next level. And so the philanthropic world could really fill this void of working with producers and with tribes and with community programs. And NAF definitely wants to be a partner and is kind of taking that first step of how we can operate in this space. And then hopefully when our 20 years is done, that we can have a bunch of other private funders in that world with us.
Yes, and I think you're right. It's desperately needed. I think the stat is that less than 0.5% of all philanthropic dollars goes into Indian country, so it's infinitesimal, right? There's not a lot of investment, and there are so many exciting opportunities with great return on the investment, so I think, you know, I'm excited about the work that NAF is doing to attract more money into these programs. So I have a ton of more questions, but I also want to make sure that we get to some of the questions from folks in the audience. So I'm going to ask maybe one more question, but remind folks to please put your questions in the chat, and we will have you ask them in just a second. So my final question, I guess, for this moment is that is kind of to pull back the aperture a little bit. Obviously, Indian country has been getting a lot of national media attention due to the impact of COVID, and there have been other developments in Indian country in kind of the recent months and years that have brought media attention. Crystal mentioned the mascot movement and the recent success of pressuring the Washington football team to change their racist mascot. There was Mount Rushmore demonstrations when Trump was visiting on July 4th by tribal leaders who view that monument as a desecration of their sacred lands. The McGirt Supreme Court decision that Crystal also mentioned that reaffirmed that the eastern part of Oklahoma remains Muskogee Creek tribal land. And of course, we can go back even further with the Dakota Access Pipeline demonstration. So there's been quite a few major kind of media attention going to some of these events. But I think that the tribal movement around tribal sovereignty also has a lot of really rich stories, and it tends to be overlooked by the media. And I'm wondering, in this moment where Indian country is getting more media coverage and more attention, if mainstream news organizations, if you feel like they're doing a better job of telling a more nuanced story about what's going on in Indian country around food and nutrition and ag, or if there are aspects of the story that are being overlooked or not quite being told. So thoughts from the panelists on that?
Yeah, I'll start off. I mean, I think, you know, hey, when your baseline is 0 to 0.04%,
one story is a big deal.
Right, but this, I mean, 2020, definitely we've seen better coverage on certain issues, but I think, you know, what the dominant narrative is around Native peoples, when we do get covered, it is always zeroing in on the disparities. And so we'll take Navajo Nation, because they've been in the news so much because of the impact of COVID. The only story they want to tell is about the lack of running water and and no electricity. And we call it sort of the broken Indian narrative, right? And it requires someone to kind of come in and save us. But the story that's not being told is that the federal government failed its obligations to provide, economic, when the COVID relief, the CARES Act money, that they held it up. Right. Even when emergency funds from the CDC were first greenlit back in March, right? And there was a study done, and there was like less than 100 ventilators in Indian country. And only
tribes had to sue to get the money.
Yeah, and so, but none of that got covered, right? But they just wanted to kind of focus on the disparities. When we look at that, because of the federal government's failure to do its job and show up when COVID hit and provide that important assistance, you know, folks began to self-organize in tribal communities. Tribal leadership stepped up. The average tribal citizen stepped up and said, we need to take care of our own. We need to protect our elders. We need to make sure that we are caring for people, that people have food and water, you know, even if they can't go out, right?
Mm-hmm.
You look at tribes, you know, in the first wave that had no cases, because, you know, the vision of tribes, like for example, in South Dakota, of the Ogallala Lakota, you know, Cheyenne River Sioux, where they literally shut down their borders, right? Or they were really controlling traffic in, and that didn't mean that people couldn't get through if they had business, but you know, those kind of measures, that's not being covered. Or there's been some actually recent stories where I would really credit actually some of the medical media covering that, the fact that the Hopi tribe has been very successful in keeping its cases low. And despite the lack of resources, it was really about organizing community health volunteers to go door to door in all of the different villages. Or here in Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation has, despite the fact we don't have mask mandates here, you know, that the tribe itself has managed to keep its cases down by following the science, listening to the scientists, and just those basics, and they've actually done a good job. So I think, you know, that's the shift, right? We have to stop getting, you know, get out of that disparity mindset and only focusing on the negative and telling the good things that are happening, right? And so that's one thing. I think the other thing I really want to flag too is that I think there's also just a lack of understanding when we talk about invisibility, that, you know, 70% of Native Americans live in cities. And Mia, you and I spoke about this recently. And so it's also, you know, for the important work that you all do, right? You know, our tribes are so important, and they are such leaders. And I love what Janie would say, we stand on the solution. We literally stand on the land to produce food where there can be abundance for all. But we can't forget about our relatives in the cities. Right. So as we think about, you know, food sovereignty, and we think about, you know, how we are going to deal with hunger in this moment, we can't forget that we have big populations of Native Americans that need to be at the table as we think about solutions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone else want to chime in? We're good.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I definitely agree with everything Crystal just said. We definitely can't forget about our folks in the cities. But as just my day to day is responding to a lot of press requests of folks who are interested in native ag and food systems. And we really don't see a ton of people who are interested in who these native producers are. And that's one of my biggest jobs at NAF, is to highlight who are these folks, who is actually doing the hard work of growing our food. Because, you know, people want to focus on a lot of the traditional food stuff, which is awesome, and that story needs to be told as well. But there's just not a ton of attention on the actual production of the food, because, you know, Colby knows all the stats. It's over 60,000 native producers are in the country. And we make up a much larger percentage of producers than we do the general population. And so there are awesome stories to be told there, and that a lot of people are producing food that is culturally significant to them, like corn at Hopi, or pretty much corn everywhere. That's a native food. And that's a really important food with an important story, with important people who are growing it. And so there's just a big gap. That's one of the big gaps that I see just in my day-to-day work.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Colby.
And I think with that, I mean, to build on what Crystal and Maria talked about is, the stories aren't there of what's happening. And, you know, when we talk about, when there's a large movement of saying wanting land back, well, what does that mean happening with the land with that? If you look at the land that's come back through the land buyback program at Interior, over 90% of that land that's come back has gone into agriculture production. So what are tribes doing when they get land back? They're feeding people. So
Mhm.
why isn't that part of the narrative? Why isn't that part of the resiliency component that gets built into the questions about how do we get through the pandemic and build systems and food systems and structures that help everybody through it?
Great. Well, thank you. I see we have a couple questions. So let me just see here. And I think if we can unmute, and the name is Lee Paskend, I think. I'm sorry, I'm probably
Yeah, Paskine.
Paskine. Thank you. I think we can hear you if you'd like to ask your question.
Oh, okay. So I had two questions. One is what policy issues that impact your various organizations and Native Americans should we know about for possible, for our own advocacy? And second question is just what are good resources for us to learn about Native American culture? I have to say I grew up in this country. I'm 70 years old. And I know just about nothing. And I'm horrified by what I don't know. But I can still learn.
Absolutely. Who wants to take a stab at that one? Thank you.
Colby, what is the what's the
Those
mission for
policies.
the first 100 days and beyond?
How much time do we have? Because we got a long list of stuff. No, I mean, a lot of it is really centered around what we talked about, is supporting tribal self-governance and self-determination and programs, and allowing tribally led solutions in these initiatives. I think specifically we've talked a lot about the importance of food assistance programs, having those be driven and led by tribes, but also we also need to look at how do we help protect and support tribal food producers and farmers and fishers throughout all of this, and ranchers. One of the things that we've talked about in addition to this is that there needs to be something that helps not only keep those folks on the land, but provides the ability for them to be able to grow and expand their production to feed more people locally. So we need more localized investment in tribal food systems and food systems in general. And I think to the larger point, what are the distribution models for that? How do we get that food to tribal citizens in cities to be able to build out those mechanisms as well too? So it's about that level of investing in both the producers and the consumers at the same time.
Crystal, do you want to take the other part of the question?
Yeah, and what I would say is, in terms of just educational resources, please don't feel bad, because now you know it's not your fault. Schools are not offering that education, and so and that's what we're trying to change. So I would say the best thing to do is really, if you all are on social media, please follow IllumiNative on social media. And every day we've been posting book lists, like history books, just fun fiction, right? Films, TV shows. Today we have a post about the 25 Native American comedians you need to follow, because you know what? We all need to laugh right now. So we're posting all kinds of lists. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. Those are primarily going to find it. I'm also, Mia, I'll email you a list that also for those people that are not on social media, because our kids don't want us on there with them, so that we can share that. And next week, if you are on social media, we're going to be featuring 3 different Native American chefs next week, who are going to be doing cooking and telling their story and their journey around food sovereignty and Native cuisine. And also we have a traditional Muskogee Creek community that's going to be preparing a meal, and we're going to be doing some storytelling around that. So please tune in next week.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
And I see Abby has a question, so maybe we can ask her. Abby, can you unmute?
I did.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's really unusual for
Good
me
morning.
to be on mute. Everybody saying, good morning, Mia. So I just really have to, first I have to say thank you to the panel. And I also have to echo Rabbi Paskine about the fact that my heart breaks every time I hear more about the genocide that the United States conducted against your peoples. But my spirit finds some resilience in the fact that you are so resilient. And I can't believe, just as I feel about people who are African-American that still believe in this country and what it promises, I am astounded by the courage that you have and the commitment. So in the work that MAZON is doing, we take inspiration from you. And in that light of, it's not too early to start thinking about the Farm Bill. And the Native Farm Bill Coalition was born recently in the last Farm Bill. And I want to know a little bit more about what you're thinking about for the next Farm Bill. And for those of us who are non-Native advocates, what can we do to support whatever those priorities are for you, and the way we can help to illuminate those if possible.
So thank you very much, Abby, for that question. And thank you for the support of the Native Farm Bill Coalition from MAZON. And also thank you for bringing up my favorite topic, Farm Bill. I sometimes feel like I have a requirement to say it at least 10 to 15 times a day.
Okay, I have to confess, my colleague Lisa O'Brien was instrumental in like goosing me about the Farm Bill. So, the thanks to her.
Thank you, Lisa, as well. We thought about the 2023 Farm Bill. I would say probably by the time the ink was dry in the 2018 one, because not only were there a lot of great successes, but there were a lot of things that weren't included or things that needed to be built upon. So we're always been looking at that, and one thing that we're also looking to do with this effort is how do we have some additional impacts in the in-between times, not only the run-up to it, but then also in the appropriations process when child nutrition reauthorization comes up, when all of these other food and ag issues are being highlighted and viewed. So, and some of the work that was really able to be done is, with the coalition is that it was, I think a very strong effort where we're able to basically build a baseline level of information built upon research and work that's been done by the Intertribal Ag Council historically, Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, National Congress of American Indians, Intertribal Timber Council, coming up with these, basically a whole bunch of different slew of ideas and all single titles of the 12 title Farm Bill. And so when you're able to kind of basically build upon and have a place for that, we launched a Regaining Our Future report, which is authored by Janie Hip as well, and I helped co-author it as well. And so being able to have a place to go. So in that effort, and we saw the strong response from tribal leaders and tribal organizations and advocates. And so out of that, the Native Farm Bill Coalition was born with a lot of partner organizations, including MAZON, who was the first ally there at the table, being able to say, yes, we support this as well. And so through all of that, when you're looking to build those kind of things, a lot of it is really coming to the table as an ally and saying, well, what do I need to know? How can I help? And how do I best go about doing this? And being able to just listen to the solutions, be able to see how to be able to be involved in that. And I know I feel very honored to be able to work so closely with MAZON's entire team on that, because I think that they really embody what that means. And saying, I remember the first conversations we had about tribal self-governance and the SNAP program. They were like, absolutely, tell us a little bit more about exactly how we need to frame these conversations when we're talking to people on the Hill, and let's go. And because of those types of conversations, we had a bill that was released in the right when I guess would be in the fall of 2018, and one that's being considered now. So being able to build those allyships led to actually something being dropped that speaks to the initiatives of things that tribal government's been asking for decades. And so that's what these types of coalition building and working relationships can really lead and build towards. And to now where we're having a conversation that is not just like with other tribal organizations, but like with everybody. Okay, it's like, okay, what does this mean? What does tribal sovereignty mean in the context of running this program? How can it work? How can we start to be able to build the bricks towards actually getting to that and building towards that? And so that's what I think is kind of the power in some of the coalition building that can happen and that we've seen, and what we're looking to be able to continue on with that. And what does that mean in other programs at USDA through conservation, through access to credit, empowering tribal financial institutions as well too to provide these services. So I think it's a very good level, a very good way of being able to establish the baseline, bringing partners to the table, and being able to have basically everybody speak with one strong voice about what the solutions are.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'd like to add to that.
Yeah, please.
I think all of our panelists have written a report with Janie before. So Janie and I wrote a report, and we published it last month, and it is called Reimagining Native Food Economies. And it's really a vision for these regional hubs where we can process and package the food that is grown in Indian country and deliver it to the consumers in Indian country. And so I can post a link in the little chat so folks can see it. But, you know, it really goes back to our societies were intertribal. We were regional economies. For my tribe, we would go down to Yakima country and would trade. And that was how our food system operated. Everyone had something to bring to the table. And so we kind of imagine a food system in the future where we don't have to rely on these government programs in the exact same way because we know they don't work as good as they should. And we have the power ourselves to feed all of our people. And so this is a framework that Janie and I worked on, and I'll share it in the chat with everybody.
Fantastic. I see we have a couple more questions, and I know we're at the top of the hour, but maybe we can touch on them really quickly. Liz, I think you had a question. Yeah, go ahead.
I do. Hello, everybody. I just wanted to ask our panelists, like for all of our clergy leadership that we have present on this call, what kind of partnership can you see from them? Like where do you need to deploy them to help support this cause? Is it in educational programming within their own community? Is it policy support outside of the community? What's your vision?
Colby, I think you're unmuted.
Sure. I'll just say I probably yes to all of the above. I think we've both Maria, because myself talk so much about educational components, is doing that at the local level, being able to partner with tribes and tribal leaders and tribal communities in your areas as well too, being able to inform members of Congress regarding what those are, being able to have those meetings at USDA to have those conversations, because having that kind of consistency and saying that you need to address issues in food access and food security for tribes and tribal citizens happen outside of the context of having ones that are focused on that are important, because that ensures that there's inclusion in the development of all the policy. So it's not just okay, how do we a specific provision here to help support a tribal food assistance program? It's how do we bring all these conversations together with tribes being involved in all of them and being mentioned and included in all of them.
Great. Crystal, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the biggest call to action I have is there's such an important role for our faith leaders, right? I mean, and it starts with education. I mean, if we can just, fight that invisibility, right? And create the visibility, shine a light in just the basic education that we now know why people don't know. So whatever you can do with your community educational events. I mean, I guess the bright side of the pandemic is that it's actually easier to kind of bring speakers in because you can speak them in. So I think, knowing that, MAZON is just, they work with so many amazing people across Indian country and the Native American Agriculture Fund and Colby. I mean, we're all resources, for speakers and education, but I think it's just at that basic educational 101 level in your community to make people aware that Native Americans are still here. And there's important things happening, both good and things that are challenges that we all need to overcome together.
Great. Visibility is power. All right. And then Britt, I think you are our last question. So let me.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
It has been so enlightening. Thank you all so much for taking the time to teach us some valuable lessons here. My question is about the international response to tribal sovereignty. I wanted to know, has there been an international response / reaction? And if so, do you see a value in international pressure to highlight the failures of our federal government to address these issues?
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, really quick, there really has been an international movement for decades. I mean, and I don't know, Colby and Maria, correct me, but I mean, at least since the 1970s, delegations of Native peoples have been traveling to the United Nations. and really, with pretty strong advocacy. In fact, that's one of my very first places I actually, in grad school got to go to the UN and intern during the draft declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which is really remarkable. And so I think there's been a lot of work at the international level to try to really have that recognition. It's just that the United States government has consistently been one of the nation states that digs in when other countries outside, recognize. And I think the UN Rapporteur on Human Rights has often come here and done a number of different, investigations and tours, particularly after Standing Rock and other things. So I think there's a broader recognition in the UN, but I think particularly now we have an administration that has made it very clear that they don't care for what the rest of the world thinks. Hopefully that'll shift in a new administration, but I think our real work is really here in the United States to move our federal government to live up to its obligations that it has to Native peoples.
Excellent. Well, I want to be respectful of the time, and I thank you all for just an extraordinary conversation. MAZON is so privileged to work with all of you, and each of you and your organizations have just been like a lodestar for us in guiding us and advising us in all of our work, and we're just so grateful for the partnership. And I think in our work together, we've seen that when tribes and Native communities are seen and heard, we are successful at demanding a self-determined and food sovereign future. So thank you so much for being a part of this program. And I want to thank all of the JCJM participants who joined the conversation. I hope you found it informative and inspiring, and I hope that we'll be able to call upon you to support this critical aspect of MAZON's work. So thank you all, stay safe and be well.